Last week was quite eventful, since the infamous Iran-Israel war began. What did it show? It revealed a few fundamental things. Well, first of all, as long as there aren't any clear results, there won't be any real impact on the global economy, because oil prices did go up, of course, but overall, it wasn't critical. Just a slight increase, and pretty much everything else stayed the same. That, in general, seems to me to be a pretty important point. The second point: even the most stubborn members of Russia's peace party have realized that all the talk about negotiations, about peace, is actually just demagoguery aimed at distracting the leadership of the country negotiating with the West, so that this very leadership can be toppled with a single disarming strike. After that, the West has no obligations, none at all. And after that, by the way, all of our oligarchs, as a reminder, the members of the Peace Party are mostly beneficiaries of the privatization of the 90s or beneficiaries of the administrative machine. They will all find themselves in an extremely difficult position because any one of them can be grabbed by the collar and told, hey, you got your wealth through corruption and illegal privatization, so everything you have is confiscated. And considering that the economic crisis hasn't gone anywhere, in fact, it's only getting worse, even the really clueless people have realized that trying to make deals with the West is pointless. Or, to be more precise, that you can only negotiate with them from a position of strength. By the way, this has probably already shown itself. For example, there was reportedly a major strike on the Kremenchuk oil refinery, which had been operating quite successfully in Ukraine all these years during the special military operation, supplying fuel to the Ukrainian army. Only because, well, rumor has it that some prominent members of the Russian elite, including those connected to the Ministry of Defense, are shareholders and beneficiaries of it. Well, what can you do, right? That's just how life is here. So, in fact, the situation in Iran has demonstrated all of this. Let's note that, accordingly, the disarming strike didn't work out. There are a few possibilities here. I'm not going to go into all the details. That's not really my area. But let's start with the first option for now. So, according to the listeners, the chance that the war will end in a day is 3%, in 3 days, 8%, in a week, 19%, in 2 to 3 weeks, 32%, and finally, the largest share, 38%, believe that the war will go on indefinitely. I don't believe it will go on indefinitely because something important has happened. First of all, the first strike was very powerful, and it was clear that in Iran, up until about 5 or 6 o'clock on June 13th, there was no authority. And then, suddenly, it appeared. Where did it come from? Who's in charge over there? I don't know. There are people specially trained for that. But authority emerged, and the response began. The response is still escalating, and it's strong. Israel did not expect this response. There's a remarkable video featuring the spokesperson, that is, the officer responsible for media relations in the IDF, and experienced psychologists watching how he behaves on screen, say that he looks somewhat stunned. Unlike Iran, where the fifth column is incredibly strong and discipline isn't great, so everyone knows everything and information leaks everywhere. In Israel, people don't really know what was hit and where, but there's still a suspicion that the targets were significant. That's the current picture as of today. Most likely, a fatal blow to Iran's nuclear program has not been dealt either. This follows from the fact that Israel has started asking for support from the United States of America. The United States has so far officially stated that they will not provide support. And here, it's important to talk about the main loser in this whole story. The main loser is the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And here's why. He actually went to the Middle East to negotiate with the Arab regimes, and he really did manage to secure promises that he would get a lot of money. Not 4 trillion, of course, but he could have gotten somewhere between 1 and 1.5 trillion. Now, there are no illusions left. It's absolutely clear that he won't get the money. This is the key problem for Trump. Because now there are 2 questions. First, how is he going to manage without that money? I want to point out, this would have been his money, which he would have received under his personal responsibility. That's the first circumstance. And the second circumstance is someone else is going to get that money. And maybe others will go as well. Because, according to some Russian experts, a portion of that money, a large portion, wasn't actually Arab, but rather from those who invested in Arabian funds, let's say, while wishing to remain anonymous. So, there's Chinese, Indian, and all sorts of other money involved. And then there's also purely Arab money. Overall, it's an extremely fascinating topic, but now it's clear that Trump won't be allowed anywhere near it. The second thing, it's already absolutely obvious that one of the main objectives Israel was pursuing. Well, without a doubt, London was backing the Israeli leadership. That's absolutely clear. I'll say a few more words about this later. But officially, Israel wants to draw the U.S. into a direct confrontation in the Middle East. In other words, Israel's goal is to get the U.S. involved in a war with Iran. So far, the United States has said no. For now, there are various nuances related to the fact that it's not entirely clear who the counterpart is in Iran. But although the United States might know this, it's not clear whether it's been officially recognized. And most importantly, how to negotiate with them. Because by now, even a complete fool in Iran understands that anyone who negotiates becomes a target for an Israeli missile. And it doesn't matter whether that was the intended outcome or not, they achieved it. And of course, this is a blow to the United States of America. Let's also note one more thing, the statement from Pakistan that it would use nuclear weapons against anyone who intervenes in the Israeli-Iranian conflict or war was, without a doubt, not actually said by Pakistan, but by China, speaking from behind Pakistan. Iran still has one very strong argument left, closing the Strait of Hormuz. And, well, there's also the question of how severe the strikes on Israel will be, because so far, it seems that no serious strike has been carried out on the reactor in Dimona in the Negev Desert, the main Israeli reactor, or on the chemical plants in Haifa, which, if hit, would make a significant part of that city uninhabitable. This is also a very interesting point, because many people believe that Iran won't do this, well, because it's just too frightening. But I don't think so. First of all, because the people who have come to power there today, and I'll say it again, I don't know exactly who they are in a state of extreme irritation. And they understand very well that it's impossible to negotiate. By the way, yesterday there was already information that Trump asked Putin to act as a mediator. But the problem is that it's completely unclear how any agreement could be reached. All right, fine. You could send someone to Iran who could negotiate. But what do you do about Israel, right? It's absolutely clear that the Israeli leadership today is not capable of making a deal. In other words, they can change the situation at any moment depending on what other unexpected blow might be dealt. So, let's look further at the results. They've hardly changed at all. 3% for one day, 8% for 3 days, 19% for a week, 32% for 2 to 3 weeks, and 38% indefinitely. So, in other words, the picture has more or less stabilized. Now, I get the feeling that Iran is basically ready to stop the situation, but only if there is some kind of guarantor. But, as I said before, it still has two very strong arguments, one of which is only potential. In other words, it's unclear whether they can actually do it, test a nuclear weapon and show Israel that they could target it with a bomb. As for the second argument, as I already mentioned, it's the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz. When it comes to Israel, it's hard for me to say. And again, everything will depend on where the Iranian missiles land this evening. They could hit, they could start destroying Israel's energy system, they could damage the fuel supply system, and so on. As I understand it, they're already targeting military institutions anyway. So basically, it's a complicated situation, and there's no clear answer to it. Now, the question is, what happens next? Actually, that's the most interesting topic. And here's what happens next. So, if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, they've kind of come out. That's it. On Saturday, the weekly review came out, but as you can imagine, by that time the war had only been going on for one day, so it couldn't really affect the macro indicators, except for the sharp rise in oil and gold prices. The increase in oil prices is very beneficial for Israel and also for all the OPEC plus countries. For this reason, no one is really going to object here. And since this is profitable, it also benefits the United States for a simple reason. They have shale oil production, which has a fairly high cost. And because of this, in order for it to be reasonably profitable, the price needs to be, well, not lower than 70. So now it has jumped up to 75. And the biggest blow will come if prices keep rising. That will hit Europe, the West, the European Union, and Israel the hardest. Well, Israel is kind of counting on getting financial support. That's it. Both China and the US have strategic oil reserves. And the US supplies itself with its own oil production. Yes, they might have certain difficulties related to the need to refine that oil. But overall, to put it simply, that's not the most interesting part. Why do I think this war might end quickly? For a very simple reason, because it is already clear that Israel cannot continue it for long. In fact, it can't fight it for long at all. Iran's economy is 15 times larger than Israel's. And yes, of course, they're hitting a lot of infrastructure targets. Just yesterday, they bombed the sewage system in Tehran. But, judging by statements from the Israeli leadership, they were counting on a revolution in Russia. It should be noted that this matched exactly the rhetoric used by the British network both in Russia and in neighboring countries after the attack on the strategic aviation airfields. But back then, let me remind you, the attack happened on the night from Saturday to Sunday. All day Monday, they kept blabbering that the bloody regime had finally come to an end. They even used such outdated terms as bloody scum. But suddenly, on the night from Monday to Tuesday, all of this abruptly stopped. At this point, I'd like to go back to the topic of the economy for a bit and say a few words about it. Why? Well, the thing is, 2 days before this attack on Russian airfields began, there was a meeting between the head of the Federal Reserve, Powell, and Trump at the White House. Given their previous arguments, Powell's visit itself, I've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating here, was quite significant. Powell's visit in itself really looks like not exactly a surrender, of course, but more like an acknowledgement that, under the current circumstances, Trump is actually the bigger, more important figure, higher in status. I tend to believe that this visit happened because the people backing Powell and those backing Trump, in other words, the national elites of the United States and, accordingly, the American faction of the Euro-Atlantic elites, have come to an agreement among themselves. Let's note another curious detail: the sidelining of the PayPal group, that is, Thiel, Musk, and company from participating in political decision-making. Musk took offense, and I understand why. He's not a man of power, he's a businessman. This was very upsetting for him. But there's one very interesting point here, really very interesting. The thing is, why were they sidelined? I have a hypothesis, which is as follows: they promised, and apparently they were confident about this at some point, a year ago or whenever it all started, that they would be able to create a digital alternative to the Federal Reserve. And for this reason, Trump spoke very confidently, saying that now we're going to punish the Federal Reserve, and indeed, in that case, this part of the Euro-Atlantic elite, the bankers, so to speak, who controlled the Fed, would have had big problems. But apparently, they realized that this wouldn't work. I talked about this right away, even a year or a year and a half ago, because the problem lies in the economic model. In other words, the current economic model in the United States doesn't allow for generating normal added value. That is, added value comes only from issuing new money. And this is a fundamentally important point. And if, accordingly, there isn't any, then what is there really? Speak. And replacing the emission-based dollar with a digital dollar won't change anything in the model. Roughly speaking, if your engine is broken, just changing the oil in it won't really make a difference. Money is like oil. If there isn't any, then the engine basically stops. That's true. But pouring in an extra bottle of oil won't fundamentally change anything either. So, the PayPal team was removed. And that means we have to enter a crisis. There was hope that it would be possible to launch, so to speak, digital issuance, and as a result write off dollar debts and basically start this whole thing over again. It didn't work out, and for that reason, we have to enter this severe crisis. This is the problem that the United States of America is facing today. I suspect that the UK has come to understand this as well, judging by the outcome of Pavlov's meeting with Trump. I'd like to point out that, to this day, no one knows what they talked about. And that's also very interesting, because usually leaks happen very quickly. If there are no leaks, it means the topic was just too sensitive. Well, I made an assumption, completely unfounded, to be honest, that, roughly speaking, they were discussing who would be the next Lehman Brothers, meaning which organizations would become the dumping ground for bad assets and would go down with them. I wouldn't rule out that it could be one of the biggest players, JP Morgan, Citigroup, or really anyone. Yeah, in this case, it doesn't really matter who gets chosen, but it's actually a very important and fundamental situation. It's genuinely fascinating from the perspective of an economist and a practitioner. It's incredibly important from a business standpoint, But, of course, no one will say anything about it because they'd get their head ripped off immediately. That's exactly why there haven't been any leaks. And everyone realized that this is how things are going to look. So, in this situation, the UK understood that it would be difficult to regulate the situation between Russia, which has been hit so hard, and Ukraine. And for this reason, the UK kind of took a step back. The Russian operation was considered partially successful because it achieved about 25% of the intended results, and it definitely didn't trigger an internal revolution. And then it was repeated. That's exactly why I believe that the planning of the operation against Iran isn't coming from Israel, but from London. It was, accordingly, carried out much more successfully, but still not completely. And that's also a fundamentally important point. Not completely. In other words, Iran was wounded, but not finished off. So now everything depends on how strong a blow Iran will strike against Israel in the next day or two, and whether it will block the Armenian Strait. We'll see this picture very soon. And, accordingly, it will become the basic circumstance that determines how all of this will continue. If the blow is very strong, then in that case Israel might ask for mercy, and then this war could, so to speak, end as soon as tomorrow. If the blow is strong but not fatal, then in that case it could drag on for another 3 days or so. And if, accordingly, Iran doesn't dare to take very serious measures, then this war could last a long time. The United States of America could theoretically intervene, although I think that for now, they're mostly just showing a certain threat to make both sides more, well, willing to negotiate. But I want to say that the presence of American planes in the air is more likely to make Israel less willing to negotiate, rather than more. It's clear that Trump is taking Israel's side in this situation, but again, that creates additional difficulties for him. Overall, I think the picture is extremely interesting.